I'm Jess. Any pronouns are fine. I did my undergraduate degree in literature at Harvard. So, what I'm talking about today is realist narratives in games. My talk title is an entire sentence: Realist narratives in games, more protagonists of color and oppressive histories. Now is the time for stories of liberation. Um, Coming up with talk titles is really hard. And I figured the most effective way to title this talk was just by stating the thesis as clearly as possible. So this thesis raises a few questions before we get into the real discussion. The first of which is, what is realism? It's a very fraught word in the art world, especially across all sorts of media. Um, so of course, like, my initial approach to this is through a lens of literary realism, primarily focusing on like a wealth of mundane daily life details. But that's not really what we're talking about in this talk, or like political realism or visual graphical realism, though those have definitely their place in games, especially visual graphical realism as graphics continue to become more and more photorealistic. But really, what I'm talking about here is conversational realism, which is to say, so according to the Oxford English Dictionary, one definition of realism is a close resemblance to what is real, fidelity of representation, the rendering of precise details to the real thing or scene. In almost all cases, uh, realism is selective, and there's no exception here. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what I mean when we're talking about realism, though it is difficult to pin down even with all of these definitions. Also, this talk operates on two assumptions. Anita Sarkeesian says this much better than I do, but games contain multitudes. We can observe their merits alongside their shortcomings, and two, racism is bad. So I'm doing two close readings in this talk of realism in games. I'm picking Telltale's The Walking Dead and Dontnod's Life is Strange 2. The reason that I chose these games is that they have outlandish, unrealistic premises in genres that we're pretty familiar with, but they also contain realist elements. So we have the Walking Dead game in the very, very successful Walking Dead franchise, a zombie apocalypse, and we have, in the case of Life is Strange 2, a young boy with telekinetic superpowers. The other reason that I'm focusing on them, aside from the fact that they have outlandish premises with elements of realism, is one of the elements of realism is a direct discussion of racial identity. So both protagonist identities as people of color are acknowledged verbally by the protagonists themselves and by the NPCs around them. Both protagonists also experience racism. So the reason that I bring this up is that this sets these games apart from some video games that now have protagonists of color, but their identities are never really acknowledged. Their race is never really spoken aloud. So these games make an attempt to meaningfully engage with the identities of the protagonists of color. So let's talk about the realist elements that exist in these games. They both share a sort of a slow pacing and movement and a focus on basic human needs. This is also a pretty direct connection to literary realism, focus on things that are often considered mundane in art, like having food and water and a place to sleep. But the things that are more the focus of this talk are the social structures and biases, sort of replicate the social structures and biases that we recognize from our lived experiences in the real world. And also, there are no happy endings guaranteed in these stories. And this is something that we'll be talking about a lot, because the endings of a lot of narratives often contain the thesis of the narrative, or the overall meaning that the player is taking away from having played the game. So the first game that I'll start with is Life is Strange 2, because it is definitely the easiest to directly engage with when it comes to issues of race. So the game focuses on the journey of two young Latino boys who live in Seattle, but after the death of their father at the hands of a cop, flee south to their father's former home in Mexico. So this plot is not only acknowledging the identities of the protagonists as young boys of color, but also the plot is propelled forward almost exclusively through racism. The inciting incident itself is an act of police brutality when their father is shot by a cop. But beyond that, in every episode, the two boys encounter some sort of violent racism that forces them to move on from a potentially safe location or an already unsafe location. So this is relevant because not only do the boys have realistic acknowledgement of their race, but they also have realistic racist experiences. A lot of the racism that we see in the violent encounters that they have with other characters use really loaded and recognizable language from American politics and from the American right wing. You can see some of this language in the screenshots below. We have a young white boy saying, then go back to your own country, and we have an older white man saying, maybe I should call ICE to make sure you're a citizen. So we can easily imagine, we've seen people say those, we've seen people saying those things, we've heard people saying those things before, but those incidents of racism are the defining elements of Life is Strange 2. So some context. Dontnod did this intentionally. These experiences very much and very directly, it is not difficult at all to say and to identify that this is a narrative that moors people of color, specifically Latin American people, in oppressive histories and a deeply oppressive current moment in America. And this is exactly what Dontnod set out to do. So we have a quote here from one of the co-directors who said, "We didn't want just one ending to feel like everything is perfect and they're just happy together." This speaks to the game's multiple endings, only one of which results in the two brothers actually fleeing to Mexico together successfully. And in that instance, though they are together, the final scene that we have of the two boys is of them facing what seems to be some sort of violent crime, the threat of some sort of consistent violent crime, without any real other context. And the other endings all see the boys separated, often by the government, through some sort of criminal justice system, putting one or both of them into some contained environment. So all of the endings are at best bittersweet, and at worst tragic. And in preparation of portraying American race politics, the developers looked at documentaries and did a lot of research to make sure that it's accurate. Again, we have this emphasis on realism. They were trying to represent something that they were observing in the world. And the other co-director said, the story of Sean is often very dark sometimes, but I also think it's realistic in our world. And I would say that he's not wrong. It's worth noting here that the directors of this game are French, that Dontnod is a French studio. I think this brings me to a point that's pretty important, I think, in this talk, which is that I think that there's an impulse right now in the games industry, especially from white developers who are very well intentioned, and hearing the feedback from a lot of people of color who are in the industry, who are playing games, and who are finding that the only representations of people of color in games right now are racist caricatures, are complete stereotypes, and totally inaccurate and not at all reflective of people of color's actual experiences of being non-white. And so the immediate remedy, the impulse, I think, that is sort of cropping up now in games like Life is Strange, the impulse is to make a representation that is realistic, that is not a stereotype, but rather grounded in actual people's experiences. And I think they did accomplish that. But without asking the question of like what this does to not only the people that they're portraying, their characters. Like this is very realistic and accurate. This is like a representation that we see direct parallels to in our real world, especially in America. But it comes all of this story comes very much at the expense of these two young Latino boys who are consistently put into vulnerable positions where they experience violence and are exploited. And so it comes at the expense of those boys, but it also comes at the expense of actual Latinx people in America. And so I think while observing this trend of trying to create more realistic portrayals, and this is not a condemnation of that per se, but rather that is not inherently a way to empower or to liberate or to uplift a community of marginalized people. So I already got into this in the previous slide a little bit, but listing out some of the direct impacts of Life is Strange 2. So largely thanks to the ending, again, which carries a lot of emotional weight, Life is Strange 2 refuses to envision a reality in which Latinx families in America can persist intact. The inciting incident is one which tears apart the family, and further, the majority of the endings of the game do not allow their family to remain together. The two boys, these brothers who form a deep emotional bond, not only throughout, the beginning of their lives, but throughout the entirety of the game, are separated from each other. And while refusing to envision this reality, where Latinx families can remain intact and together, they're simultaneously envisioning a reality in which telekinesis is possible. This is a critique that is sort of in line with Adrian Shaw's thinking in Gaming at the Edge about gender and gaming at the margins of gamer culture. She had a critique of Fable that said a similar thing, which was that it was interesting to her that in a game where you were having sword fights and using magic, certain types of marginality and realism were being imposed on the players. In that case, on the basis of gender, I believe, although in this case, on the basis of race. It also inherently ties Latinx identity to experiences of violence, as the boys are consistently having experiences of violence on the basis of their identity throughout the game. And it asserts that reality for Latinx Americans is bleak and hopeless, which, again, the reality of being Latinx in America for some, especially undocumented people right now, may sometimes seem bleak and hopeless. But it is unclear what the developers are accomplishing by replicating that, especially in light of this following point, which is that the game critiques individuals' racism. Like every racist who inflicts violence upon Sean or Daniel is portrayed as a bad person. It is condemned. We are on the side of these young boys. But they fail to critique the systemic racism that produces those individual views. So I'm thinking primarily of the final episode in which Daniel and Sean are about to cross into Mexico, and Daniel, the younger brother, is shot by a racist vigilante patrolling the border. Then the two vigilantes and the two brothers are both taken into custody by the Border Patrol agent who appears on the scene. And then when Sean is in holding, separated from Daniel, asking when he can see his brother and if his brother is going to be okay, somebody in the facility says to him, "Don't worry, they don't hurt children here." Which seems to me, again, this brings to the forefront of the conversation selective realism. That the developers chose to give the Border Patrol agents a free pass in this one, to sort of assert that they don't hurt children for some reason, which to me personally is still a little bit baffling, especially given that it seems to be that the thesis of this game is to critique racism and to portray like the suffering that racism has caused in America, especially when we have documented evidence that Border Patrol agents and ICE do harm children. Um, and so not only does this selective realism come at the expense of the protagonists of color, undermines um, any sense of realism about race in America in the first place. This makes the game feel unrealistic. Um, so that raises a lot of questions about what the goal of this is, who is benefiting, and why. So this brings us to a closer reading of the Walking Dead game. The Walking Dead as a franchise has always been known for its sort of gritty realism and for not pulling any punches when it comes to like tragic endings. Um, the racial dynamics of this game are nowhere near as explicit or as directly addressed as they are in Life is Strange 2, but there are quite a few racial dynamics on display, especially in Season 1. So the way that I'm going to examine this is by comparing its two black protagonists, Lee and Clementine. So in Season 1, we meet Lee. We first see him in the back of a cop car. This imagery is obviously loaded, in part because of the ways that black people are policed and the way that they're persecuted and exploited by the criminal justice system. But when the cop car hits a zombie, the focus of this narrative immediately shifts to survival. At which point, Lee meets a young girl, Clementine, who becomes his ward for the rest of the season. Now, as they encounter other characters, racial tensions begin to build between them, between Lee and the other characters, not between Lee and Clementine. And there are some instances in which this is very direct. Kenny, a character who is a fan favorite, calls Lee urban and then apologizes for it. And another white man persistently refers to him as a boy. So this coded language is very clearly racialized, and Lee has some opportunities and dialogue choices to address these things. A lot of Lee's relationships are colored by racial tensions between characters. At the end of the story, unfortunately, at the end of the season, Lee meets a tragic end at the hands of zombies. This ending in particular carries a lot of baggage because of the figure of the zombie itself. This could be the topic of a different talk entirely, but zombies have often represented embodied anxieties about Blackness and slave uprisings, especially in the rural South, which is also the setting of the Walking Dead games. So it is particularly ironic and painful that Lee meets his end this way. By comparison, we then have his ward Clementine, who is the protagonist in seasons 2 and 4. Her ending is very different from Lee's. I think we were all relieved at the end of season 4 to see that she lives happily ever after with a ward of her own, AJ, a young black boy. In many ways, Clementine's story runs parallel to Lee, with the key ending being very different. However, throughout her narrative, there is no mention of her racial identity whatsoever, despite several opportunities to do so, several moments when she and other characters are discussing her hair, and despite the fact that just one or several seasons prior, Lee was experiencing direct racism from his peers. Instead, she sometimes faces coded language in regard to her gender. She often faces sexism and is dismissed as a little girl, addressing both her gender and her youth. So the impact of these things. So for one, the protagonist whose Blackness is spoken aloud is doomed. Lee dies a very tragic death, and does not get to see his ward succeed later in the series. And also Blackness takes a backseat to femaleness. Clementine is only ever discussed as a little girl, even in season 1, when she is navigating the world alongside Lee, who is very much acknowledged as a black man. And this is also particularly unique because people often assume that she is his biological child. And yet, none of the racial dynamics that he encounters are extended to her. Additionally, Telltale is exhibiting essentially two ways of experiencing blackness for its protagonists in the series, and as well exhibiting two modes of blackness to its players. One is essentially the erasure of blackness, being black without acknowledging it, in Clementine's case. And the other is acknowledged, but only through racist remarks and microaggressions. The only purpose that these racial remarks about Lee serve in season 1 is to add some sense of gritty realism to the environment that Telltale is building, and also to ground Lee in an oppressive history of racial dynamics in the South. So this brings us to another larger question. So what? So a lot of games and narratives do this. These are just convenient, high-profile examples. But more importantly, this displays an inability of a lot of studios and designers and developers to reconcile two things: meaningful acknowledgement of race and favorable narrative outcomes for protagonists of color. So I think there's a question here of how we do better, or at the very least, how do we write narratives about protagonists of color that don't moor them in oppressive histories? First of all, I don't know. Representation is really hard. I obviously would not claim to have any answers about that. But second of all, I do have suggestions. One, take advantage of the medium. Games have historically always been very at odds with realism. They've always been like very escapist art forms. And I think that that is something that people can take advantage of, especially in portraying the narratives of people of color. And something that I haven't seen people do a lot in franchises or games that are about protagonists of color. Another really basic thing is to give protagonists of color happy endings. I think a lot of the critique that I've presented here today would be pretty significantly undermined by either the leads of Life is Strange 2 or by Lee ultimately getting a happy ending at the end of their narratives. I think that is also a really direct way to empower, basic though it may seem, giving protagonists of color narratives that see them triumph in the end, especially over oppressive situations, is an easy and direct way to empower the demographic that you're representing, which is essentially the next point. Write narratives where people of color triumph over oppressors. I think there's something to be said for realism in games. I think there is something to be said for realistic portrayals that draw on oppressive histories, that draw on real political tensions that exist. But I think that those are particularly productive and particularly liberating and empowering when those oppressors are portrayed and they are triumphed over and they are defeated, which is something that I don't think we see a lot of in the games industry. I also think it's useful to remember that realistic portrayal is not the same thing as empowering portrayal. They can be two separate things. They can be two things that tie together, but they aren't the same. This is also identifying sort of the impulse I was talking about earlier when discussing Life is Strange 2, that in order to sort of undo some of the damage that like racist caricatures in games and stereotypes in games have caused, is to correct by creating realistic portrayals. That is absolutely like a valid approach and can be productive, but it's not the same as creating an empowering portrayal. I think the narrative has to do more work than just present something real in order to empower their players and empower the demographic being portrayed. I think my final suggestion here is, again, a very basic one as well. Hire more non-white narrative designers. I would say you should do this for the obvious reasons that we all know, but there are also some less obvious reasons. So when discussing Lee and Clementine's experiences of race in The Walking Dead, primarily Lee experienced his race and the player experienced his race through instances of racism. non-white narrative designers are going to have a more holistic perspective through their own lived experiences of what it means to be a person of color, and the experiences that define being a person of color. To be sure, I would say that racism is a part of that. I think as a person of color, racism is definitely something that has been part of a defining experience for me. But it is certainly not limited to that. I think there is a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and warmth and other emotions that come with being a person of color, and also specifically from communities of color, which non-white narrative designers are more likely to have direct experience with. So that's it from me. If you have questions, thoughts, follow-ups, feel free to email me. I'm also on Twitter. And regardless, I hope you enjoy these photos of my cat.